So she examines how the mechanism linking stressors, particularly traumatic stressors, with ill health, and particularly PTSD. She focuses on the effect of stress on the immune system and the health consequences of stressor-related immune dysfunction. In the lab, she also investigates the potential of digital and pharmacological interventions. She is super well published, 97 peer-reviewed papers, almost, I think about half of them first or senior author papers, published in JAMA Psychiatry, Psychosomatic Medicine, Nature Scientific Reviews, and others. She's also very featured on media outlets, if you want to check out her website. There she's talking about her work on health and vaccination outcomes related to the pandemic. She received her PhD in clinical psychobiology from the University of College Dublin before coming to UCSF for graduate and postdoctoral training, including here at the Health Psychology program. She received numerous awards, including a Fulbright Scholarship and a Care 1 Career Development Award. And I'm very excited about your talk today on making sense of elevated inflammation and PTSD from acute phase proteins to acute and chronic illnesses. So thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Just bear with me while I get started. I have to share my screen first. So thank you all for being here. Lots of familiar faces and new faces too. So I would love if this could be sort of a discussion. We don't have a huge group. Feel free to put your hand up, or if you're in the room, to shout out any questions or points of clarification. And if we go over time, if I go over time because of that, I have an early stopping point. So I hope I haven't overpromised the promise of making sense of elevated inflammation and PTSD. I would say the answer to that question is in progress. But let me tell you about some of our data, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it might mean. So the first question is something I often used to skip in my talks, but what is PTSD? And not everyone is completely familiar with this. So PTSD in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is made up of 4 categories of symptoms. First, intrusions like flashbacks and nightmares. Then avoidance of people, places, but also thoughts and feelings. Then symptoms of altered arousal and reactivity like hypervigilance, hyperarousal, sleep disturbance. And then symptoms that are very similar or overlapping with symptoms of depression, changes in thoughts and feelings, usually negative thoughts and feelings. And what is so compelling about PTSD for us as stress researchers is that PTSD is the only psychiatric disorder that has stress built in. So we know that stress is the major risk factor for most of the adult onset psychiatric disorders, but you can't get a diagnosis of PTSD without exposure to trauma. Many of the symptoms of PTSD are tied to that trauma, and the evidence-based treatments for PTSD target aspects of that trauma. So I really think about PTSD as an important condition in its own right, but also as a model for understanding links between mental health and physical health, and particularly along the continuum for stress to psychiatric disorder to other kinds of ill health. So there are psychological aspects of PTSD, and those are the ones that are dominant. If you look through the DSM symptoms, it's all mostly psychological symptoms of PTSD. But there are also immunological aspects of the disorder that get a lot less attention. And these are aspects that we're really focused on in my lab. So one of the first questions that we asked about PTSD and immune function was whether PTSD would be associated with heightened risk for autoimmune diseases. And we were coming at this from the point of view of data showing that PTSD is associated with blunted glucocorticoids, with elevated inflammation, with accelerated telomere shortening, accelerated biological aging. And so we looked at a sample of 666,000 Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. These were a young cohort with a mean age of 31, and 12% of them were women, which is about standard for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. The first thing we noticed was that 31% of these veterans already had a diagnosis of PTSD by 2012. which was absolutely mind-blowing. And a further 19% had another mental health disorder. So first of all, the burden of trauma in this population was really immense. And then we looked at risk for autoimmune disorders in those with PTSD and with other psychiatric disorders. And here's what we found. Other psychiatric disorders, circled in blue, increased risk for these 5 autoimmune disorders that have definitive diagnostic criteria or diagnostic tests that are pretty common in the population. And secondly, we found that PTSD was associated with even higher risk for these disorders. And actually the risk associated with PTSD was 2. So that people with PTSD were twice as likely to be diagnosed with one of these conditions, which is really striking if you think about the young age of the sample. So when we worked on this paper back in 2012, there was a phenomenal research assistant in my group called Kristen Nishimi. And Kristen went off to a little known college on the East Coast called Harvard and did an MPH and PhD. And I'm very grateful that then she came back and the two of us remained really fascinated by this question and convinced there was more to do. And Kristen has taken on this project and has really taken it to the next level. So Kristen, in her career development award at the VA, is using electronic health records from 9 million patients. What I'm going to show you today is just the first subset, the first analyses that she's done on a subset of 133,000 of these patients with 10 years of follow-up. And so just like our prior study, the exposure is PTSD or other mental health disorders. But the outcome in this case now is 46 autoimmune diseases. So last time we looked at 5, and now she's including all of the common autoimmune diseases that are diagnosed. And here's the general model for how she does this. So she takes this cohort and looks at exposure being PTSD or other mental health, and then the outcome being any of these autoimmune disorders. And she's using data from 2010 to 2019. And sort of a relief to us, but also really striking, was that when she included all of these extra diseases in the model, the effect size is much larger. So in this case, in this 130,000 sample, the risk for any of these autoimmune disorders and PTSD is 3 times higher. And for other mental health is 2.5 times higher. Because of her sample size, Kristen's also looking at moderators. What we're seeing is that the effects are even stronger in older people who have much stronger rates of these autoimmune conditions. And we are also really interested in sex differences because autoimmune diseases are much more common in women. And PTSD is about 2 to 3 times more common in women. And our prediction was that these effects would be even stronger in women. And that's not what we're seeing, actually. What we're seeing is the opposite. The effects seem to be stronger and more robust in men. And that's something we're seeing across a number of studies now. If anyone wants to talk more about sex differences, it's a really interesting piece coming out of multiple studies. Sorry, I'm admitting people and it's slowing me down. So Kristen came back to UCSF from her PhD with a view to working immediately on these autoimmune disorders. But she started her postdoc in June 2020. And at that time, we all felt this intense pressure to study COVID-19. And so we set up a longitudinal cohort study, and we also started thinking about the outcomes of people with PTSD within the VA. What would happen to these individuals in the context of this infectious disease pandemic? And so the first thing we looked at using data from February 2020 to June 2021 was the risk for hospitalization and death in veterans with and without PTSD. So to do this, this took a lot of thinking, we took everyone who had positive COVID test in the VA system. So a lot of veterans came to the VA for their PCR test. I hate asking people to go back and think about the pandemic. You probably hate it more. But in those times, if you remember, we were getting PCR tests all the time. It was really frequent. This is people, 228,000 unique people who had a positive test. They had a mean age of 60 years. They did have quite a bit of medical comorbidity. And we looked at 60-day hospitalizations and 60-day deaths after a positive SARS-CoV-2 test. Again, the numbers at the time that we first looked at this data were really shocking. So 15% of these VA patients were hospitalized and 6% of them died. We looked back 5 years prior to February 2020, so pre-pandemic diagnoses of PTSD, other mental health. And then we adjusted for a wide range of possible confounders and covariates. And what we found was that all of the psychiatric disorders that we looked at increased risk for hospitalization and death following a positive COVID test. Post-traumatic stress disorder in this case was just in the mix. It was actually, it had the smallest effect size of any of the disorders for hospitalization, and it was just sort of in the middle for deaths. Nonetheless, it was an important predictor of outcomes of COVID-19. And one thing that's really important to think about in these data is that people with PTSD tend to be seen more often in the VA. We thought this could go in the other direction because they would be more likely to be tested in the VA. But so we're kind of working against that here and still seeing an effect. Then the vaccines came and we all thought this would be the end of COVID infections. And when it wasn't, we thought breakthrough infections were a real anomaly after vaccination. The VA started vaccinating people in December 2020, and we used data up to November 2021. Again, we had over 250,000 veterans with positive SARS-CoV-2 tests. This time they were a little bit older. They had a mean age of 66, and about 15% of them had a breakthrough infection. We look back again 5 years and looked at the same categories of disorders. And what we found was that when it came to breakthrough infections, all of these conditions increase risk for breakthrough infections. Small effect sizes, but again, at a population level, an effect size like this is really meaningful. So breakthrough infections proved to be the rule, not the exception. And what became a really important public health topic after that was the possibility of long COVID. And we had a small study, longitudinal cohort study, where we're following people and seeing evidence of more long COVID in people with PTSD. So we went again to the VA data to look at whether people with PTSD would have higher risk for long COVID, starting at the very beginning of the pandemic, or as early as possible. Once long COVID started being diagnosed, which was around December 2020. And in this case, we had 660,000 veterans with a mean age of 60, and 1.4% of them had a diagnosis of long COVID by February 2023. I don't think we think enough about long COVID, because even in this cohort, that was like almost 10,000 people living with a diagnosis of long COVID. And we all know that the chances of getting diagnosed with long COVID are probably slim. So this is probably an underestimate.
Can you say something about the diagnosis code that you use?
Yeah.
And what that means when it's greater or equal to 2?
Sorry, yeah. Thank you so much, because I definitely should have talked about that. So the diagnosis code means that they had a diagnosis of long COVID at least 2 appointments. So this U09.9, which people are not using reliably, like this is definitely an underestimate, because people write long COVID in the chart without actually using the ICD code a lot of the time. But here's what we have is the code. Also, people could have symptoms that are not explained that are long COVID. So we took quite a conservative view in only using the diagnosis code and only including people as cases if they had at least 2 separate appointments where they got the code.
And you don't know what goes in, like what goes into the
symptoms
the code. Because I only
yeah.
ask just because I'm really interested in this space, and like the like the way in which it's categorized has changed over time. And there's like different places that use different criteria. And it's my understanding that there's a paper about to come out in JAMA that's a new set of symptoms.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's just really hard to operationalize it.
Completely. And this is probably very dependent on the specific VA that you attend and whether people at that VA are open to
Yeah,
long
I wonder about that too.
if they are using it. So I think the symptoms are clear for this code, but the diagnosis is really tricky, and particularly when it comes to, I'm glad you made us pause here, Eric, because particularly when it comes to somebody with a psychiatric disorder getting a diagnosis of long COVID, when many of the symptoms of long COVID overlap with symptoms of psychiatric disorders, it's so tricky. And we certainly thought what we might see here is a low rate of long COVID in people with psychiatric disorders, because you come in and you complain of fatigue and sleep disturbance and cognitive impairment. I think depending on the diagnosis you already have, a clinician with 15 minutes is going to be very likely to say, oh yeah, that's explained by your PTSD. So it's a really tricky thing to study, and I'm glad I'm going to look for that paper. It sounds helpful. So again, you kind of know our system here pretty well at this point. And then we looked in the past 5 years for any psychiatric disorder diagnoses. And here's what we found. And the data did actually get really interesting. So what we found was that for any psychiatric disorder, for depression, PTSD, anxiety, adjustment disorder, alcohol use, we found the expected increased risk for long COVID in this sample. And the tricky piece is the symptoms overlap with psychiatric disorders, but people with psychiatric disorders have a lot of risk factors for developing long COVID or any other sort of post-infectious disease, chronic disorder. But for people with substance use and psychotic disorders, they had a lower risk for being diagnosed with long COVID. And it's hard not to think that that could be accounted for by stigma, that people with substance use disorders or psychotic disorders come in talking about new symptoms and they are just not given the diagnosis. Yeah, any other thoughts on that? And in this case, PTSD actually had one of the stronger effect sizes. So the question that I've been grappling with for kind of an embarrassingly long time now is, do psychiatric disorders cause immunological disorders? So is it that after you have PTSD, your immune system changes and you get heightened risk for these conditions and for worse outcomes of infectious diseases, which we could never study before COVID because we never had a disease that was so widespread that had a definitive test? Or do these immunological disorders increase risk for psychiatric disorders, which at first glance is not plausible? Why would arthritis cause you to have a diagnosis of PTSD? But it really could, because it just pushes you over into the level of fatigue, the lack of resilience that might lead to you getting the diagnosis. Or are there common mechanisms across immunological and psychiatric disorders? And this is kind of where I land, although I think there's truth to all of these hypotheses.
Can I just
Yeah.
on that? Because I was thinking about this particular chicken and egg problem. And I was also kind of wondering, like, couldn't it also not be a disorder, but like a vulnerability, like an immune vulnerability? And then you are exposed to significant trauma, and then you end up with PTSD.
Yeah, I think,
Or is there?
I think that's exactly right, because I said at the start, PTSD is caused by trauma. You can't get PTSD unless you're exposed to trauma. So it's an environmental psychiatric disorder, except it isn't. It has significant genetic heritability. So there's something else. Most people who are exposed to trauma don't develop PTSD. There is a vulnerability. A lot of times when we're seeing individual cases of patients, I have to say, I think a lot of the time that vulnerability is prior trauma exposure, childhood trauma exposure. Trauma begets trauma. We actually have a paper with that title. people who have had trauma end up finding it really hard to avoid other kinds of trauma. If you have childhood trauma, it limits your chances to build a life that is free from subsequent trauma. So yeah, I think there's both probably biological risk and then also environmental risk that predates the trauma that elicited the PTSD. So my money is on inflammation as this common mechanism, which doesn't preclude any of what Kaya mentioned or anything else we've talked about, because inflammation could be a mechanism that ties together all of these different factors. So inflammation is the body's normal response to injury and infection. It's a beautiful system that really does keep us all alive and functioning. And what's less well appreciated about inflammation is that it has such powerful effects on the brain, on brain function and brain structure. And I have a quote that helps to kind of encapsulate this, which is, if inflammatory cytokines, these proteins that regulate inflammation, were discovered by neuroscientists instead of immunologists, they would be called neurotransmitters. And that is absolutely the case. They play such a critical role in the functioning of the brain. And when you begin to think about that, it's much less surprising that our immunological disorders and psychiatric disorders coexist so often. So going back a step there for just a minute. Yeah. Could you say that again?
Yeah.
The quote, the whole thing.
A little bit more for
Yeah.
me, and then maybe everyone else could benefit from hearing it again.
Yeah, it's probably my favorite thing to talk about, so I'd love to say it again. And I agree, it's kind of complex. So like, inflammation is the body's normal response to injury and infection. And for, I don't know, hundreds of years, we've thought about it as being an immune system phenomenon. But somebody said, and I swear to God, I'm going to take credit for it soon because there is no source for this. Somebody said it to me. If inflammatory cytokines, and those are the proteins that regulate the inflammatory response, if they had been discovered by neuroscientists instead of immunologists, they would be called neurotransmitters. They play such a critical role in the functioning of the brain. You can't learn or remember without inflammatory cytokines. When you're stressed, it changes the level of inflammatory cytokines in the brain and changes how the brain is prioritizing different kinds of activities. It changes how we feel, they change how we remember, they change how we think. They're really critical. And inflammatory markers sort of tie together all the different phenomena that we're thinking about in this model, from prior vulnerability to trauma exposure to the development of autoimmune conditions, infectious diseases, and psychiatric disorders. And so, yeah, hopefully what's another thing that's exciting about these markers is that they can be modified with existing treatments. So thankfully for us, immunologists are really busy trying to figure out exactly how to modulate this system. And hopefully we could piggyback on that in psychiatry to begin to reduce the negative effects of trauma.
I'm just gonna start quoting you. That'll help. Like,
Yeah, that'll help. Give me
get it on
credit.
the map.
Yeah.
Helpful framework. Yeah.
It's so helpful. I know. I really just want to find the source, but if I can't, I feel like I have no choice. I take credit for the news. No, I do. Sorry, there's enough fake news. This is not my quote. So how could trauma lead to elevated inflammation? How could all this come about? Well, most of the people in this talk probably are well aware about the biological stress response, but we know that when someone's exposed to trauma, these are some of the systems that are engaged. So when we experience threat, it activates a specific pattern of brain activity that activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the autonomic nervous system, And immune cells bear receptors for all of these stress hormones, and they are incredibly responsive to us perceiving psychological stress, psychological threat, psychological stress, whichever. So in response to these signals, immune cells release higher quantities of these inflammatory cytokines, and then those cytokines feed back and tell the brain what to do. And there are other parts of these systems. It's not that it's the only signaling pathway involved, but it is a key pathway. So that's the short term. Why would it be, and this is what we're really trying to figure out, why would like a short-term inflammatory response have such long-term consequences? Well, it looks like, first of all, that traumatic stress leads to long-term effects on inflammation. So people with higher levels of childhood adversity have higher levels of this protein, C-reactive protein, which is an acute phase protein, a major systemic inflammatory marker. And people who have higher levels of adult trauma also have higher levels of this protein. And the combination is associated with more inflammation again. And this is really incredible. Like your immune system actually bears a signal of all the trauma that you've experienced in your life. And I think this is a key piece that we don't that I don't grapple with enough. Something about cumulative trauma exposure that makes a difference. There's something about shifting this system multiple times that's really critical. So could inflammation then contribute to symptoms of PTSD? All of these large-scale studies that I wish I did really point to the immune system as being powerfully involved in PTSD. So whether you do a GWAS study or an epigenome study, you will usually find that you're implicating immune-related genes in PTSD. And then Mendelian randomization studies have also linked PTSD and autoimmune disorders, indicating that their common genetic risk for PTSD and autoimmunity. And then almost everything that we have done so far is about peripheral inflammation. There are a few really great studies looking at central nervous system inflammation, but most of the time we're relying on peripheral inflammation. That's not necessarily a bad thing because any interventions that we come up with will likely target peripheral inflammation first. And that's a real positive because we want to regulate the system and maybe not without regulating the brain directly. So peripheral inflammation is just having a big influence on what happens in the brain because inflammatory markers can bind to receptors on peripheral nerves and send messages back to the brain. There are leaky regions of the blood-brain barrier where these markers can pass through to influence activity in the brain. There are active transport mechanisms to get inflammatory proteins across the blood-brain barrier into the brain. And the meningeal space around the brain, turns out it's chock-a-block full of immune cells that are conveying signals between the brain and the periphery. So the idea that we had about this immune privileged status of the brain has really fallen apart in the past 10 years. So once these inflammatory proteins get to the brain, what can they do? They can elicit cognitive and emotional psychiatric symptoms. People who get pro-inflammatory treatments, which are much less common now, for cancer, multiple sclerosis, hepatitis, 40 to 60% of them develop full-blown episodes of major depression. So in these cases, these pro-inflammatory cytokines are causing depression. Inflammation plays a causal role in learning and memory. This is something we're really thinking about a lot more lately. And there are strong causal relations between inflammation and sleep. And if you have any questions, you can go directly to Eric. PTSD is associated with higher inflammation. So this is a study that we did on clinically assessed CRP in VA patients. And we had a sample of over 16,000. All of the psychiatric disorders were associated with heightened inflammation, which is really striking. It was a young group, again, of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. these are pretty high levels of CRP to have in these groups. And we found that when we removed PTSD from the other groups, so what you see in this prior slide is any disorder with or without any other disorder. But then when we removed people with PTSD from the other groups, actually the only ones that survived were PTSD, depression, anxiety. These are the only disorders that had heightened inflammation. There's a lot of complexity there, but I think these are the conditions maybe most associated with heightened inflammation.
But all those other effect sizes are almost the same.
Yeah,
They're just smaller.
it's true. It's true.
groups.
Yes, they are much smaller. Some of them are substantial
Yeah.
sizes at the same time.
Yeah, it just
And-
looks like a subtle like it looks like a
It's
p-value
subtle,
difference
yeah.
and less of an effect size difference.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. And
But the
There is-
PTSD one is definitely higher, like than those
Yeah.
other ones over there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's true. And it
Yeah.
has a lot to do with specific diagnostic practices in the VA and your chances of getting PTSD. So like we can't take it super, super seriously. But I do think across the literature, even beyond this data, the most robust evidence links PTSD, depression, and much less so anxiety with elevated inflammation. In a prior study, we looked at transcriptional control pathways in PTSD, and this is something that requires further work too. What we found was that using Steve Cole's very cool TELUS system, that within a group of people with PTSD, there was greater pro-inflammatory signals in PTSD compared to controls, and lower levels of glucocorticoid anti-inflammatory signaling in PTSD. This was consistent with a whole load of other evidence as well, particularly evidence on glucocorticoid receptor signaling in PTSD. So it will be possible, especially now that methods are enhanced for looking at this at a molecular level, that we're going to begin to understand the exact signaling pathways that are involved, giving us greater capacity to come up with targeted interventions. So coming on to some new data, a question we have had that has come out of all of this. So it's quite frustrating, is inflammation predicting PTSD? Is PTSD predicting inflammation? A lot of our studies give us no capacity to look at this, but the Aurora study is a prospective cohort study that was completed across multiple emergency departments in the US. And we're working with Sam McLean and Sarah Lindstedt on this, who were some of the leaders of Aurora. And what they did was they captured 742 people in 29 emergency departments, and they took a blood sample in the emergency department. And then they repeatedly assessed their PTSD symptoms for 6 months. And so people came to the emergency room around, on average, 2 days post-trauma. And, well, this says post-admission, I think it's post-trauma. So and for the most part, these are people who had motor vehicle accidents, but it could also be assaults. It could be anything. And we looked at the levels of their inflammatory proteins in the emergency department. The goal of this is really to understand whether inflammation around the time of the trauma changes how you're processing the traumatic event, leading to increased risk over time. So you might immediately be thinking, oh, what about someone who, had a major injury versus someone who didn't? Someone who had a big wound and someone else who didn't. How could that possibly predict their risk for PTSD? Our hypothesis is that it doesn't matter why you have high inflammation. It doesn't matter if it's from the psychological experience or from a wound or from anything else. You will be at heightened risk for developing PTSD if you have higher inflammation at the time of your trauma. And that's because PTSD develops because of, it seems, impaired learning and memory around the trauma. So in the normal run of events, what should happen after a trauma, if you're going to recover, is that you're exposed to a traumatic event and you have a strong memory around it initially, as you should. And then over time, you develop new fear extinction memories that compete with that memory. So for example, if someone in a red car crashes into you, for the subsequent few days, it makes a lot of sense. You're going to be really frightened of red cars. But if you continue to encounter red cars and you don't have an accident, you should be developing new fear extinction memories where red cars are no longer threatening for you. And because inflammation impairs your learning and memory, you're unable to develop these new fear extinction memories. And that is our hypothesis for why you would have higher risk for PTSD. I guess you're really hoping the next slide shows that it is heightened risk. I really was. So in green here, you can see that is what we found. These are not large effect sizes, but this is messy data. But what you see in green is that an index, so a combination of 4 pro-inflammatory markers, was associated with higher levels of PTSD symptoms in the subsequent 6 months. And that was true for IL-8 and IL-10 in particular. And then we further looked at sex differences. And again, we would hypothesize women have stronger inflammatory systems. They have much higher risk for PTSD. We would hypothesize that women will have greater risk. And that's not what happens again. So in the case of the pro-inflammatory index, interleukin-8 and TNF-alpha, and almost IL-6, you're seeing that the effect is stronger in males. When it comes to this anti-inflammatory marker, IL-10, the effect is stronger in women. But there's something we really need to grapple with when it comes to sex differences.
The blue square is male.
Blue square are the male, yeah. And the red circle is the females.
So one of the things that I'm struggling with, I've been thinking about this a lot with regard to parenting behavior and how inflammation might alter capacity to learn about parenting. So if more inflammation, like higher levels of inflammation, and I know it's pretty complicated per cytokine, like suggests like higher PTSD, but then wouldn't higher inflammation also potentially translate to more learning from a therapeutic intervention?
So higher inflammation is worse learning.
Worse learning.
So our proposal is that it's a failure to develop the fear extinction memories. So there's beautiful science on this. So PTSD develops when you develop a trauma memory, and everybody develops the trauma memory. It's really salient, and inflammation doesn't come on board for 15 minutes, although interestingly, trauma memories are not accurate. People have very poor memories of trauma, even though
they're learning about the trauma. There's initial learning.
you're like red car, dangerous, you know?
And that's also, I'm like, does that mean your higher inflammation is helping you also encode the trauma memory more?
So
That's I think where I'm getting a little confused.
So the way it works, it seems to work in PTSD, and the evidence-based treatments for PTSD are cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure. And they specifically target fear extinction memory. So they specifically try to get people to develop fear extinction memories, because it's not that you can weaken your trauma memory.
Right, you learn.
You can only develop competing fear extinction memories. So we have not grappled yet with the trauma memory piece. I have thought about it a lot.
Yeah, because it seems a little bit like if one.
Why isn't it impairing the fear learning? Is a question.
They seem to operate on a similar thought process, but also maybe the timing of the trauma. But what if you're more stressed going into the trauma and you're already have these are the things that I'm.
There's so much to figure out. One thing I've thought about is like, okay, so these memories are not good either. Like there's, evolutionarily, we have to develop very strong memories of trauma, and we do. And then we have these like flashbulb memories, and we learn to avoid things that cause the trauma or associated with the trauma. But they're not accurate memories. So something else is going on there that isn't just about remembering. And actually, sometimes we'll remember things that are entirely false. And so that's a process, that's like an acute inflammatory process that's really complex. And obviously people with PTSD develop very strong trauma memories, and there's some evidence that people with PTSD have enhanced fear learning, but it's actually not strong evidence. The strong evidence is about fear extinction. So you're completely right in asking that question. I think we don't really know, but I can come up with a story about it, but I think there's just more to be done. Yeah. And there's another question from Sharon Packer Rosenthal. Sharon, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, hi, sorry, had to figure out how to unmute myself. I was just wondering if you're looking at neurotensin at all as helping to extinguish the fear memory.
Wait, looking at what, ketanserin?
Neurotensin.
Neurotensin?
Yeah.
No. Do you want to say more? I haven't.
Sorry, I put a citation from Science magazine, Nature magazine, and there's other research that it is something that can loosen the I don't know how to, I'm a psychiatric social worker, but it can loosen the memory that's binding. So people are looking at neurotensin in other places, I guess.
Yeah, no, but I will look into it more. And there's a lot to figure out about what to do about the memory in the moment. Thank you. So one hypothesis we've been working on, but I've already kind of given away where we landed with it, is that inflammation specifically enhances threat sensitivity. And that's how inflammation might drive symptoms of PTSD. And evolutionary, it makes a lot of sense. If you're under threat, that you become more sensitive to other threats to try to enhance your survival in a dangerous environment. So PTSD is associated with greater cognitive interference by threatening stimuli, enhanced fear learning, but that evidence isn't as strong as the evidence for impaired fear extinction in PTSD. Increased physiological reactivity to threat of shock, this is strong evidence, and increased attentional bias towards threat. In one study, we looked at symptoms of PTSD that are specifically related to the construct of threat sensitivity and found some evidence that those with higher threat sensitivity have higher levels of these inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein and white blood cell count. We've also looked at inflammation and fear potentiated startle, and we did this in an experimental study, which is something we're pursuing a lot now to try to get at causal direction. Because in some ways it's a little disappointing when you find the correlational evidence and it supports your hypothesis, it's still not convincing enough. So in this study, we had people do a blood draw, then we gave them typhoid vaccine, the polysaccharide form of typhoid vaccine, which elicits inflammatory activity, or placebo. Then 2 hours later, we did a blood draw. 4.5 hours later, we did another blood draw. We enrolled 24 men in this pilot study and 12 of them got vaccine. They were pretty young cohort. And we gave them this fear potentiated startle paradigm. So in this paradigm, they get 10 loud sounds that are startling under a low threat condition where the sign on the monitor in front of them says shock not possible, and there are no electrodes attached to their hand. In the ambiguous condition, the sign on the monitor says shock not possible, and there's an electrode attached to their hand, which we tell them is a shock electrode, so you could get shocked. And in the high threat condition, they are told that shock is possible. They have a shock electrode attached to their hand, and they do get shocked at strategic points of the paradigm. So what we found in PTSD was that in general, people with PTSD have heightened heart rate responses to the startle stimulus, to the sound, under ambiguous threat. So everyone has a low response under low threat. Everyone has a high response under high threat. And people with PTSD under ambiguous threat, they look like they're in the high threat condition, and healthy controls in the ambiguous threat condition look like they're in the low threat condition. And so we were interested in seeing, could acute inflammation change responding in this paradigm. And so we gave them the vaccine, and we found a really robust effect on interleukin-6 and effects on a whole host of other inflammatory markers, but for sure the effects were strongest for interleukin-6. Everyone at least doubled in interleukin-6 at 4.5 hours, and a lot of people quadrupled in levels of IL-6. And what we found was that under low threat and ambiguous threat, what we found was under ambiguous threat and high threat, people who got typhoid vaccine had high responses, and so did people who got placebo. So this was a little bit surprising. We expected to mimic our PTSD findings. We didn't. But under low threat, the people who had typhoid vaccine had higher heart rate reactivity, suggesting that inflammation, I mean, it's a bit of an overstatement, but like suggesting that inflammation put them in a state of threat, even when it was purely inflammation and they knew they couldn't get shocked. So we are now taking the next step on this work, funded by NIMH, and we are specifically targeting fear extinction learning. I need to keep an eye on the time. So we are going to, again, use the paradigm of polysaccharide typhoid vaccine and look at whether an acute inflammatory challenge impairs fear extinction. So we've talked about it already, but just to go over it again. So this is a graph taken from a study of mice, but it's simpler version. So in this case, mice learn that a tone is associated with a shock. And every time they hear the tone, they get shocked and they develop a fear response to the tone. And in the fear extinction phase of the paradigm, they're presented with this tone alone multiple times, and they develop fear extinction memories, and they stop freezing in response to the tone over time. This is a healthy fear extinction response. It looks like in PTSD, what happens is people are immune for some reason, pardon the pun, to developing the fear extinction memories. So they continue to associate all the stimuli around their trauma with fear, even when they're presented with them in safe environments. And our hypothesis is that one reason this happens is that every time they have an opportunity for fear extinction, and you can only develop a fear extinction memory if you're afraid. So you need to be presented with the triggers, with the reminders, and learn at the same time. If acute inflammation blocks your ability to learn, then you're never going to develop a fear extinction memory, because every time you're afraid, you will develop heightened inflammation, and it prevents development of the fear extinction memory. So that's our model for this study, that trauma triggers will lead to acute inflammatory response, impair fear extinction, both in real life and in the setting of prolonged exposure cognitive processing therapy. So it's not just that you can't develop the fear extinction memories out in the world, but you also can't develop them in therapy, and that this impairs PTSD recovery. And I'll have to come back and talk about that.
Like Kirsten Oshbacher worked with us, Alicia Lieberman's data, and found that women who had really high pro-inflammatory gene expression, even though this trauma intervention is wildly successful with caregivers and their children, it was not successful for women who entered child therapy with high levels of pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory. So it was like, it's also in this other context of learning about trauma with their children.
Totally. And higher pro-inflammatory markers predict response to antidepressants. So you're less responsive to an SSRI if you have high inflammation, and you're less, I think George Slavich has a good meta-analysis on this. You're also less likely to benefit from psychotherapeutic interventions if you have high inflammation. But if you can't, you can't benefit from an intervention if you can't learn. And the circumstances are perfectly established to like prevent learning. But I don't know, in that case, is it possible to put somebody like in a lower state of inflammation before they get the intervention?
Yeah, like a, like, what do you think? That like an anti-inflammatory medication would be
So
helpful?
I think an anti-inflammatory that's definitely what we propose. Like, so every time you go to exposure therapy, you pre-treat with an anti-inflammatory. Now, we don't know which anti-inflammatory it should be, and that's a big problem.
The dosage and like, is it just
the
in
dosage.
therapy or
Yeah.
like all the time while you're doing therapy?
Exactly, or when you're out in the world, if you think you're gonna go somewhere that reminds you of your trauma, that you take an anti-inflammatory. But also, meditation could do it, or being in a really safe environment, asking someone to come in for their appointment for an hour before, and like having a relaxation room, like putting someone in a very good physiological state before intervening.
So interesting.
Yeah, but maybe the anti-inflammatories too. So we're actually out of time, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to give it time for anybody on Zoom
Yeah.
to ask a question, yeah.
Any last minute?
Good.
I mean, the discussion was kind of baked into the talk.
Yes,
but
that was on
any-
purpose,
Any big
yeah.
picture?
I'm glad you put the question slide up.
Yeah.
We're sure what to do.
Okay, yeah, any last questions? It was really fun to get your thoughts. I mean, we can talk more about interventions.
I'm really curious.
I did have a question. If you are looking at trust as a way of maybe lowering the anxiety or lowering the inflammation response.
But trust, I
So,
think,
sorry, go ahead.
I think that's such a good point. We know that rapport is critical to the outcome of psychotherapy. And it's highly plausible that it's about safety. For sure, prolonged exposure can't work if someone doesn't feel safe. And there is some understanding around that. So trust is probably vital to putting someone in the right physiological state.
And of course, that's expensive because it takes a long time to develop trust in therapy, in a therapist.
Exactly. And yeah, and then it is, baked in that for some types of trauma, make it harder for you to trust,
Absolutely.
making it even harder to benefit.
So I wish you would talk more about that.
I think we're
That's
at
fine.
the end of,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
We take more.